The Black Hole, a novel by Alan Dean Foster. Chapter 9. Reinhardt continued to gaze past them, past the parameters of his ship. His was the look of a man whose dedication was coupled with disregard for anything but achieving a particular end. Such a gaze belonged only to true visionaries. Also, true madmen. "You strive to attain a most singular end, Doctor," an awed Durant finally added. Reinhardt replied without smiling, "No, Dr. Durant, to attain the end of a singularity." "That's crazy," Booth chimed in, not caring now whether he might provoke Reinhardt to anger or not. "Impossible! It's impossible to travel into a black hole, let alone through one." It was not the aspersion Booth indirectly cast on Reinhardt's sanity that upset the commander of the Cygnus, but rather the reporter's scientific absolutism and negativity. "Impossible? Impossible is a word found only in the dictionary of fools." He was barely holding his anger in check. Pizer glanced at Holland. Reinhardt noted the look, saw that at least the captain was giving the proposal serious consideration. It calmed him somewhat. Foolish to allow a popular demagogue like Booth to upset him. "Mr. Pizer," he told the first officer, "I was dreaming of this when you were still flying kites. If scientists habitually restricted their researches to only what their colleagues considered possible, we would still be living in caves, or on the Eurasian landmass because of fear of sailing off the edge of the Earth, or restricted to the Earth alone because exploration of the cosmos might not seem financially feasible. Such attitudes are characteristic of the Dark Ages. I am surprised that any of you," and he looked around the table, "would adhere to such deterministic nonsense." "Dreaming is one thing, the dangerous pursuit of dreams another," Holland argued. "People have dreamed for years about such an attempt and have failed every time. Drone ships have managed to get close, but eventually all are trapped by the collapsar's gravity, and they vanish beyond the event horizon." "You disappoint me, Captain Holland. I expected more empathy for such a journey from someone like yourself. Have you no desire, no curiosity to know what may lie on the other side of a black hole?" "There is no other side," Booth insisted. "Anything that enters a black hole is smashed down to nothingness by the strength of the gravity." "That's one theory," Reinhardt readily admitted, unperturbed. "There are others." "The scientific consensus today says there's nothing on the other side," McCrae put in. "Yet if there is another side, which is where Mr. Booth and I disagree, then by definition there must be something there. As I've just pointed out, my dear, the scientific consensus once insisted the world was flat." "It's not possible," Holland still spoke thoughtfully, his voice devoid of ridicule. "Every leading scientist says it's not possible. Except this one," Reinhardt said loftily. "Assuming the impossible for a moment," Holland finally hypothesized, "that your field functions as you believe it will, and that you can also generate enough power to break through to this imaginary other side, how do you propose to return?" Reinhardt surveyed him with the full pity the dedicated scientist reserves for the layman. "My dear Captain Holland, I do not expect to return." By now, the pool table was surrounded by mechanical spectators, all viewing the action through optics operating on everything from infrared up through the ultraviolet. Mutters of amazement and admiration filled the air. As yet, Vincent's remarkable display of pool prowess had not engendered any apparent hostility, not even from the mechanical he was playing against. Making the usual ultra-rapid calculations involving distance, mass, and energy, Vincent lined up his next shot. Another ball tumbled neatly into a far pocket. Nearby, the old Bob unit he had befriended looked on in astonishment. The tension cue seemed to have become an extension of Vincent's mind as well as his body. Vincent noticed the flicker of lights on the older machine, flashing the admiration sequence. The only way to win. Never give the other fellow a shot. Run the table on him. He tilted himself sideways in the air, lined up a ridiculously difficult shot, and banked it home. A chorus of incredulous buzzes and murmurs rose from the robotic audience he had attracted. Are there any more like us on board? Vincent set up his next shot, a tough 3-ball combination. Bob shook its head no. But something had finally convinced the old machine to talk. I'm the last. There were others, but our series was fairly new when the Cygnus was first outfitted. A lot of us revealed bugs. Everyone except myself failed early in his journey. He turned prideful, tried to correct the list to his hover. I might have been one of the first in the series to be properly composed. I'm still operative. These upstarts think I'm some old freak. Vincent made the shot easily, moving to follow up as the cue ball glided to a halt. We are still the pride of the fleet back home. He fired another ball in. There are units like you and me operating at every level of fleet command, also in private commercial service. We're highly regarded and valued. You could be fixed up easily enough, install some of the latest reaction circuitry and logic capacitors, and you'd be good as new. No, better than new. How would you like to go back with us? The hum of conversations surrounding the table and players abruptly ceased. A couple of the machines near Bob flashed warning lights. Vincent appraised the scene and the attitude of the other robots. All were Reinhardt made or modified. None appeared sympathetic to his casual offer. He decided he would find no allies among these mechanicals, with one possible exception. I think you'd be wise to drop the subject, Bob advised him. After studying his audience a moment longer, Vincent gave the equivalent of an electronic shrug. Forget it. I was just joking. We wouldn't have room for additional machines anyway. Then he added as an idle afterthought. One of those parts Maximilian drew for us doesn't work. I'll be needing a replacement for a regenerator boost. Module number A34. He turned back to the game as if nothing had happened, lined up another ball. That shot does not compute, insisted one of the, again, fully absorbed onlookers. Don't bet on it, Vincent warned him. I have not yet begun to compute. He made the shot with extra English to spare. It catalyzed the expected flurry of electronic oohs and ahs. It also allowed old Bob to slip out of the recreation room without being noticed. Booth had his recorder out and activated. He set it next to his plate. Reinhardt either did not notice or had no objection to the reporter's recording his statements. The latter was more likely. Holland was the one currently talking. According to what you told us, Doctor, the surviving lifeboat survey ship has been converted to accept both your matter-antimatter energy system and the gravity field distortion unit. But you say it has only traveled to the event horizon, not past it into the black hole itself. I admit that being able to pass that close to oblivion and return successfully is a tremendous achievement. Reinhardt didn't change his expression, accepting the compliment as his due. But it's akin to sailing a ship atop an ocean, as opposed to diving it to its bottom. When you begin traveling beneath the surface, you have to deal with radically different natural forces. It's the same when you pass the event horizon. He tapped the plate idly with a fork. How do you expect the Cygnus to escape being crushed by the gravity in there? Most theories hold that the center of a black hole no longer contains anything we'd recognize as mass. It's simply a self-sustaining gravity field of incalculable strength. I would assume, Durant interrupted, that Dr. Reinhardt has sufficient confidence in his field's ability to bend the damaging effects around his ship, to drive a hole through what we might call, for lack of better terms, solid gravity. Indeed, Reinhardt was clearly delighted to have Durant's support. "I know that you're thinking that one slight error in navigation could be fatal, Captain. That is your field, and so I accept your criticism where that is concerned. But I know exactly what I am doing and how I shall proceed. I have worked on the requisite calculations for nearly 2 years. The course I've chosen will take the Cygnus into the pit at the most acute angle possible. The incredible speed generated by the ship's engines will be augmented by the gradually increasing pull, which will rise to a climax as we strike the event horizon. The combination should permit me to slingshot through the dimensional warp I believe exists at the center of the singularity in an instant, long before the shielding null-G field enveloping the Cygnus can be collapsed. I have no intention of waiting around inside the event horizon to test the ultimate limits of that field. It will be sufficient if it protects the Cygnus for several seconds." "You're going to encounter all kinds of secondary effects before you ever reach that point." McCrae sounded as dubious as Holland. "What about the intense radiation, the heat generated by the collapsing matter entering the hole?" "My previous probings and all my studies have shown that if I remain exactly on course, the Cygnus will pass through unscathed. Furthermore, since the heat within the collapsar's accretion disk is gravity-related, much of it should be diverted around the Cygnus by the null-G field." "Fantastic!" Durant was completely overwhelmed by the proposal. Both the notion itself and the physics involved were beyond my concepts of magnificence. He shook his head slowly. His thoughts were a confused mixture of awe and disbelief. They were mirrored in his expression. Having disposed of his last opponent, Vincent drifted away from the pool table. Most of the robots who had watched the contest remained there, crowding around the table. They pushed and shoved one another for the chance to use the cues. With considerable frustration and little success, they were trying to imitate Vincent's techniques. The 3-level pinball machine crackled and chimed satisfactorily as Vincent operated the dozen flippers within. His mind was not on the game. It appeared he moved randomly from one machine to the next. All the while he was edging closer to the exit. At last he allowed a final ball to find its own noisy way through the labyrinth of the last machine and slipped out into the corridor. The sentry robot who had been keeping watch on him turned away for but a moment. When his gaze returned, it was in time to see Vincent scudding down the corridor. He signaled to his companion, and both moved quickly to the doorway, looked out. One glanced up the corridor, the other down as they functioned in tandem. Vincent was just turning the far corner. Moving on smoothly, pumping metal legs, the 2 sentries rushed after him. Vincent was not restricted to such anthropomorphic methods of locomotion. The instant he turned the corner, he accelerated on his repellers and shot down the corridor, rounding another corner where 2 passageways intersected. The sentries reached the same turn, peered around it. Vincent was long gone. Their comparatively one-track minds struggled to account for his sudden disappearance, failed. Blinking in confusion, they hurried down the wrong corridor. Durant's mind was working furiously, trying to make sense of unheard-of possibilities. In the light of so fantastic, so grand a proposition, it was hard to consider things rationally. It was a losing struggle to moderate his enthusiasm. "So you want the Palomino," he was mumbling, "to stand by and monitor your journey. You want us to act as observers to record your passage?" "To another place," Reinhardt told them. "And another time, where—" Booth was making a show of adjusting his recorder. It distracted Reinhardt. Somewhat broke the mood of scientific ebullience which had filled the dining room. "What are you doing, Mr. Booth?" "Just changing the sequencing on my recorder." He smiled apologetically at the commander of the Cygnus. "I wouldn't want to miss anything." "Commendable of you," said Reinhardt. "Thanks. I think it's important we be sure and get your last words, for posterity. It'll serve as more effective warning against this sort of insanity than anything I could make up." Reinhardt's momentary euphoria turned once more to anger. Durant he could manipulate with the promise of new wonders. He could tease McCrae with memories of her father. Holland and Pizer he could overawe with his knowledge. But Booth retained the maddening, smug self-satisfaction of the ignorant man confident in his simple view of the universe. "You're not the first to think me mad. Better men than you, Mr. Booth, have accused me of irrationality. I could dismiss that. Others laughed at me. That I could ignore with justifiable contempt. The worst, though, were those who conspired against me and what I was attempting to do. In such cases it was necessary to—" He caught himself, looked down at his food. When he gazed at the reporter again, he had regained control of himself. "Left to men like you, Mr. Booth, we would still be living in the dark times of the second millennium. I promise you I will be victorious." "For a man who likes to think of himself as an educator, you talk an awful lot of conquest," Holland observed. Reinhardt stared at him. "You would accuse me of militancy, Captain Holland? Very well. I accept the label, but I am a soldier only in the cause of science. I do not think victorious too strong a claim for the triumph I shall experience. And when I have done what I say I shall do, others will try to follow." There was no humor in his smile now, nor did he try to temper the edge in his voice. "And if successful in such attempts, they will then have to deal with me." "And what role would such people play in this newly discovered universe of yours?" McCrae was watching him closely. But Reinhardt no longer seemed to care about appearing tactful or diplomatic. The moment of triumph over his enemies and scoffers was at hand. There was no longer any need to hide his zealousness from these few visitors. "Perhaps none. I have created on board this ship the beginnings of an entirely self-sustaining mechanical civilization, which responds to my orders and discipline, and which—" Holland wanted to hear more about Reinhardt's plans for his machines, but the commander broke off his speech as Maximilian re-entered the room. Again, only Reinhardt was able to interpret the series of electronic sounds and lights put forth by the huge mechanical. When Maximilian had finished, Reinhardt turned back to them. The interruption had sparked a by now familiar transformation. Reinhardt again was at his gracious best. "Good news?" Holland inquired. "Indeed. See for yourselves." He pointed to the viewport. An approaching brightness was now clearly visible against the farther stars, sunlight glinting off an incoming ship. "The probe I have referred to is about to dock. There are things I must do. I will see you again soon." He pushed back his chair, rose. "Please, continue your meal." He smiled tightly. "There's nothing you can do to assist, and the docking procedure is dull and familiar. Excuse me." He followed Maximilian out of the room. "Well, Doctor," Booth said as Reinhardt was leaving, "no matter how foolhardy I think you are, win, lose, or draw, it's one heck of a story." The commander of the Cygnus disappeared without replying. The door closed behind him. Holland had thoughts of trying the closed door to see if they had been locked in. Reinhardt's cool warning about straying unescorted around the ship still burned in the captain's mind, but there was no reason yet to force anything. If the door was locked, there wasn't anything they could do about it. Better to do as Reinhardt had suggested and enjoy the rest of the dinner. There was a chance their regular dining schedule might be interrupted in the near future. Booth looked around the table, uncertain to what extent his companions shared his analysis of Reinhardt and the man's absurd proposal. Eventually, his gaze came to rest on the first officer. Pizer stared back at him for a long moment. Then the younger man spoke while glancing toward the now closed doorway. "Cuckoo as a Swiss clock." He turned around to his own meal, downing food as if the devil himself were after him. Holland's thoughts were on the problem that might be raised by disciples of another type. He was watching Durant worriedly. The Palomino's elder scientist was not eating. He was standing by the viewport, staring silently at the approaching probe ship. Vincent touched a sensor plate. When the door obediently slid aside, he drifted into the dimly illuminated maintenance room. As he had hoped, a familiar shape was waiting for him, the battered but still talkative pool player he had substituted for. "My name's Bob 26, Biosanitation Battalion." "Of course it is," said Vincent agreeably. "But since you're the only unit of your type aboard, you can now leave off the series number." "I couldn't talk freely before. Those other machines, the ones built or altered by Reinhardt, they would have had me disassembled. I have a lot to tell you." His ill-lubed repellers whining faintly, he moved to the door and carefully scanned the corridor. "If Maximilian knew you were here unescorted, it would be the end for both of us." Vincent hoped his words sounded as contemptuous as he intended they should. "You've no need to worry about that clumsy dirt mover. I can't understand why you're all so intimidated by him. If you go well prepared into the jungle, the drunken elephant can't fall on you." "What's an elephant?" Bob asked. "Never mind. We'll have your memory tripled when we get home." He was hunting about the desk area, reasoning that the items they needed would be where the supervising robot could keep close watch on them. "Do you have lasers?" Old Bob moved to a counter. A thin, irregular-shaped metal bar extended forward from one of his arms. It fitted neatly into a socket in the countertop. There was a click. Several drawers popped open. Vincent gave the weapons thus revealed a professional once-over. All were slightly archaic, but quite sufficiently lethal. Not that he had a choice. He chose a pair, checked to make sure they were fully charged, and turned to leave. Bob called for him to wait. "Listen, I don't know exactly what you have in mind, Vincent, but I'm with you. I've had enough of serving as negative pole for every theoretical machine on this ship, and I don't like Reinhardt, though it's against my programming to do anything about it. Not that anyone could with Maximilian always hovering around him. Whatever you're planning, I'd like to help in any way I can." "I was counting on that, Bob." Again, Vincent moved to depart, and once more he was held back. "Something else?" "There are a few other things you'd better know about this ship," the robot began. "Your friends could be in grave danger." "I have confidence in Captain Holland and First Officer Pizer," Vincent informed him. "In my opinion, they often err on the side of caution, but for humans they can move decisively when events require. I'm certain they are amply suspicious of Commander Reinhardt's intentions, and will treat any suggestions of his with due care." "It involves more than suggestion, Vincent. You don't know anything, and neither do they. This has to do with—" The probe ship drifted toward the upper surface of the Cygnus and the waiting dock. It decelerated smoothly, showing no ill effects from its epoch-making journey. Durant still stood staring out of the viewport of the dining room. He wished Reinhardt had invited him to go along to greet the probe pilot, even if it was mechanical. But the commander had not, and Durant had elected not to press the request. A genius like Reinhardt would divulge secrets and discoveries when he saw fit. That was his right. Pizer sipped the wine and spoke to the introspective McCrae. "What does your feminine intuition say, Kate?" She blinked, sat up straighter, and looked across at him. "That hoary old superstition? I don't know about it, but logic and reason tell me that for all his apparent accomplishments, Dr. Reinhardt is walking a tightrope between genius and insanity." "I opt for insanity," mused Holland aloud. That comment prompted Durant to turn away from the port. "I'm sorry, Dan, I don't buy that. Dedication isn't madness. Maybe he's a little over-enthusiastic in his quest for answers, but many great scientists are. He has more reason than most to want to vindicate himself and his theories. Considering the length of time he's lived alone out here, devoid of human companionship, I'd say he's done a hell of a job of hanging on to his Stability? Whatever else he may be, Booth ventured conversationally, he's an out-and-out liar. I visited one of the main hydroponic stations. He grinned at Holland's expression of surprise. You weren't the only one curious enough to go for a solitary stroll, Dan. That tiny one-man garden of his that he told us about over dinner, the one just big enough to supply his personal needs, it's big enough to feed an army. Nothing so strange about that, Durant defended the absent Reinhardt. A small portion of one station is devoted to the raising of foodstuffs, while the rest is kept cultivated to assist in purifying the air. Remember, the Cygnus wasn't equipped with anything as sensitive as our up-to-date synthesizer regeneration system. Those closed recycling systems still only serve a small-sized crew like our own anyhow. If he wants to move and work freely about the Cygnus, he has to maintain full atmospheric pressure throughout the ship. So he's forced to maintain the greenery to help clean the air. Pizer looked unconvinced. For my money, it'd take a lot more than a few trees to purify the air around here. He glanced at Holland. Tell him about the funeral, Dan. Funeral? Now McCrae was intrigued. Yeah, Pizer went on. A robot funeral, with robot pallbearers. Almost human. Durant voiced the expected skepticism. A decade or more than any human contact might make the man a little eccentric, but you can't ask me to believe he's programmed his robots to act that human. Exactly. Holland was moodily eyeing his no longer appetizing meal. I know what I saw, though. It was a funeral complete with shroud and solemn observance. I can't say what it was a funeral for. The outline under the shroud looked human, but it could have been anything. It was ejected from the ship before I had a chance to try for a closer look. Why go to such elaborate lengths to dispose of a robot? Durant's tone mixed cynicism with amazement at Holland's seeming gullibility. Besides, such a procedure would be wasteful. No matter how badly incapacitated, any mechanical could be beneficially cannibalized for spare parts. Maybe the Cygnus has no need of such spares, but I don't think Reinhardt would be needlessly wasteful of anything, especially material as valuable as the components of a sentient robot. I told you I didn't say it was a robot. What's that supposed to mean? Holland looked hard at him. We have only Reinhardt's word for what happened to his crew. Durant grew angry. The sort of possibility you're hinting at is incredible. You're going to find yourself very embarrassed if you raise the subject with the commander. He'll skewer you with records, tapes, all sorts of indisputable independent corroboration of his statements. I hope so. Ship's coming in, said McCrae, changing the subject. They watched as the probe passed their viewport and settled into its dock. Holland was forced to admire the efficiency with which the secondary craft had been modified to accept Reinhardt's new propulsion system. Her silhouette looked unchanged. She was an impressive little vessel, as big as the Palomino. Booth spoke as they observed the descent and link-up. Speaking of humanoid shapes in the funerals of we-don't-know-whats, I ran into something else a little too human in the hydroponic station. Holland was on him immediately. For instance? For instance, the robot in charge of controlling the operations there? It was almost human, too, in its malfunction. What makes you think so? Booth only shrugged. But Durant wouldn't let it pass. Yes, what was there about another robot to spook you, Harry? Reinhardt can't be everywhere on the Cygnus simultaneously. Certain minor operations must have to take care of themselves. This robot looked like it had been taking care of itself for quite a while. It had a limp. And that's what spooked you? I don't spook, Alex. I've dealt with about every kind of mechanical the cyberneticists have created. From military police models down to broadcast independents with enough brains to translate ancient texts for you. What I'm telling you is that I had a gut feeling I was looking at some kind of person. I've seen damaged robots in operation before. Even if it's a household luxury model, a damaged humanoid type with a bad leg walks with a certain unmistakable stiffness. That includes those with flex limbs made of polyethylenes, but this character moved differently. He walked more fluidly than any injured machine I ever saw. What the devil are you suggesting? That we get off this ship as soon as possible, Holland finished for him. Both men turned to look at the captain. Politely, if we can. Surprisingly, it was Booth who objected. Hang on now, Dan. If Reinhardt's engines can generate enough power to hold him steady here for we don't know how long, I figure he's got enough to pull away from this spot without any trouble at all. So? Pizer was watching Booth warily. The reporter was apt to go overboard if it could mean a better story. Such enthusiasm was commendable, it had also been known to get people dead. Booth continued excitedly, So why not take this ship and Reinhardt back home? Easier said than done, but Holland couldn't help considering the thought. Not all that much easier. Now that he had broached the possibility, Booth rambled on as if he were proposing the most natural solution in the world. We've got 2 scientific whizzes to figure out his computer setup and reprogram the robots. The programming can't be all that complicated. It's 20 years behind the times. Alex and Kate are not. If Reinhardt's managed to arrange things so that he can run this ship all by himself, the 5 of us plus Vincent ought to be able to do likewise without working up a mental sweat. And while Kate and Alex are working on navigation and cybernetics, 3 of us are left to take care of Reinhardt and his steel dog. He paused for breath, then rushed on. Think of it. Reinhardt won't mind in the long run, not once he's been besieged for information on his new drive system in the Null G field. He'll thank us for dragging him back home. The government will be delirious because they'll have the Cygnus back and can use it to recoup their colossal investment, even if they just turn it into a museum. The established research institutes will have 2 decades of new data to pour through. See? He concluded brightly. Everybody eventually benefits, even Reinhardt. Reinhardt would disagree with you, Harry. Booth frowned at Durant. He would today, sure, but not once we're back on Earth, not if he's been telling us the truth. And if he hasn't been, it's our duty to take him back. He can face acclamation or trial, it's all the same to me. We could be heroes. We could also be dead, Holland pointed out. Durant turned away from them. I don't believe what I'm hearing. Leaving aside the fact that Reinhardt is considering the greatest experiment in the history of modern astrophysics, he'd never consent to relinquishing his authority over the Cygnus. Never. You can believe you're hearing this, Alex, Holland said firmly. My job is to get you all off this ship alive. That's my responsibility, and that's what I intend to do. The greatest experiment in the history of modern astrophysics notwithstanding, once we're safely away, we'll see about monitoring any crazy schemes Reinhardt has in mind. He turned to the reporter. As for your suggestion, Harry, I suggest you cool it. Don't bait the bull. I've done that plenty of times, Booth spoke proudly, and I'm still hanging around. We're all aware of your accomplishments and your heroic investigative reporter background, Holland replied soothingly. But don't push that man. That's an order. You're not operating alone now. I have to think of everyone. You ought to as well. I don't want to see any of us left behind. Booth glared at him momentarily. Then he seemed to think things through and relaxed, nodding agreement. We still have time, he told himself. He was certain that he could eventually convince Holland that his, Harry Booth's, plan was best for all concerned. If he could convince Holland, then Pizer would automatically go along. McRae could be persuaded. Durant, Alex would be a problem. His judgment was blinded by Reinhardt's visions. But he was only one man, and more inclined to fight with his intellect than with a weapon. Weapons were likely to be important in the upcoming discussions, Booth knew. Ghost Ship Cygnus returns, reported by Harrison G. Booth. No, Harrison G. Booth reports. Return of the ghost ship Cygnus. That sounded better. He returned his attention to the viewport, much pleased with himself. Reinhardt entered the pressurized cylinder, Maximilian following closely behind. Ahead, the probe ship could be seen locking into the Cygnus's reception terminal. Soon it will begin, Reinhardt mused. The culmination of my life's work. The answer to one of science's greatest mysteries will be revealed. The possibility he might die did not concern him. If it had, he would have returned to Earth long ago. He feared only ignorance, not death. The latter he knew for what it was, a cessation of the flow of certain fluids, the degradation of internal electric impulses which conveyed stimuli, and the eventual dissolution of various organic molecular structures into dust. He shook his head sadly. He could not fathom other men's fear of dying. Why, how could they be so concerned with existing, when for the most part their existence was a waste? They contributed nothing, achieved nothing, merely took up space. Everything they did, every action of their meager lives was geared toward inefficient utilization of their environment for petty personal ends. Yet they continued to insist their way of life constituted a civilization. The cylinder moved toward the probe terminal.